Hi everyone, Olivia Issa here from IsaFit. I'm at home now trying to keep up with social distancing. And now that we have the time and most of us are at home, I know a lot of people were thinking about taking this time to learn a new skill or take up a new hobby. And I know personally, I learned to sew through the internet. So scrolling through Pinterest, YouTube, and I thought I'd take this time to share what I've learned over the years with you all. So I put together a little video series that I'll update every week or so. So follow along to learn a little bit about how to get started sewing if you've never sewn before, or if you do know how to sew, just some projects to get going with. So to get started on that, I thought I'd give a brief tutorial on how to set up your sewing machine. So thread the bobbin, thread the needle, and two stitches, the straight stitch and zigzag stitch. So to do that, I have two scrap pieces of fabric. I have thread. Usually I'd use a matching color, but to show you all stitches, I decided to go with this bright blue one. I have some pins and my favorite scissors. Additionally, I have an empty bobbin. We're going to fill that bobbin on our sewing machine. For any project using your sewing machine, you're going to want to have matching thread on the top and bottom of the machine. And to do that, you're going to fill your bobbin. Now note that every sewing machine is set up slightly differently, but they all have the same materials even if they look a little bit different. So to start, we're going to put our main spool of thread on the big peg on the top of the sewing machine and take our thread and pull it through a small clasp in the back and then bring it forward and loop it around this little peg. Most machines have a small diagram near the peg on how best to loop it. Then we're going to take our empty bobbin and locate the small hole on the top and pull our thread through that hole, making sure to hold on tight to that thread. Next, we're going to pop the bobbin on the small peg towards the back and shift it right until you hear a click. At this point, it's vital to keep holding on to the thread coming out of the bobbin, otherwise it might unwind as you go. Now, using your foot, press down on the pedal until the bobbin starts to spin. It will slowly fill until it almost reaches the edges of the bobbin. Once you've filled it about 3/4 of the way, cut the thread, shift the bobbin back to the left until you hear a pop, and remove it. Now it's time to put our bobbin in our machine. My machine has our bobbin facing up, but yours might be inside the machine, so if you need help finding it, reference your machine's manual. To start, I'm going to remove the plastic covering around the bobbin that sits under the foot of my machine. Next, I'm going to take my bobbin and make sure the thread is wrapping around the left side of the bobbin and insert it facing up into my case. Then I'll wrap the thread through this plastic overhang and leave it around the side. Now it's time to thread our needle. To do that, you're going to take the thread out from around the peg, but keep it in that small clasp. You're going to loop it through this hook in the back and bring it down this line, which I call a snaky thing, but it's really just a line. Hook it around the bottom and bring it up, and you're going to look for a hook that's attached to the needle. Now, sometimes if your needle is down, you won't see the hook, but you can use what's called a hand wheel at the back of the machine. If you turn it clockwise, it'll bring the hook and the needle up, and you can loop your thread around that hook and bring it back down. Once you've passed through the snake, you'll have between 1 and 3 other hooks to go through depending on your machine. Loop your thread through those hooks and then take the end of the thread and pull it through the small hole at the head of the needle. You're going to want to pull it as far through as you can and hook the thread through the foot. Now it's time to pull your bobbin thread up to the top. So start by making sure at least 3 inches of bobbin thread are peeking out from the case. Put your cover back on and take hold of the thread that you just put through the needle. Then you're going to lower your needle by turning the hand wheel counterclockwise all the way so that the needle dips down and comes back up. You're going to pull the top thread from your needle until you see a loop of the bobbin thread hanging around the top thread. You can pull that thread through with your fingers or a needle until it's all the way unfurled. Now that we've set up our needle and bobbin, we're going to move to our fabric. I'm going to start by facing the outsides of each piece of fabric towards each other and lining them up along the straight edge. I'm going to use my straight pins to mark where I'm going to sew about 1/4 inch in from the edge of the fabric. This 1/4 inch is called seam allowance, and it's the distance between the edge of the fabric and where you're going to sew, which protects the seam so that if the fabric starts to fray a little bit, it doesn't interrupt the seam. Now it's time to set up for our straight stitch. My machine has a dial, but every sewing machine has a different way of setting up your stitch pattern. So whether yours is a button or touchscreen setup, make sure to look for the universal symbol of a straight stitch, which is this dashed line. Then I'm going to check my stitch length. For this project, I decided to go with around 2. And next, my width. For a straight stitch, it doesn't matter how wide your seam is, but I just set mine to 5. Now I'm going to place my fabric below what's called the foot and put the foot down to hold the fabric in place. I'm aligning my pins to the middle of the foot, and I'm holding on to the top and bottom thread with my hand. Starting by sewing slowly by pressing my foot onto the pedal under the table. And when I get to the end, I'll use my hand wheel to take the needle up, lift the foot, cut my thread, and then you can see I have a clean, straight line along the top of the fabric. Again, I have my 2 pieces of fabric, and if I open them up now, you can see I have a straight seam that connects the 2 of them. So now I want to practice using my zigzag stitch. So I'm going to sew a seam adjacent to my straight stitch seam. And again, I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance as I pin along that side. Now to set up my zigzag stitch, I'm going to turn the dial until it reaches the zigzag pattern. And then I'm going to adjust my stitch length to be a little bit longer to a 3 so that I can make sure to see my zigzags. So again, I'm going to lay my fabric with the pins in the center of the foot, and I'm going to hold on to the bobbin and the needle threads for the first couple stitches so they don't get lost. And pressing the pedal, I'm going to sew a straight line. Cut the thread, and you can see I have a straight line of zigzag stitches. Now, once you finish a seam, it's important to tie off the ends so the thread doesn't unravel. To do this, I'm going to take my straight pin and slip it under the last full stitch I made and pull it through. And when I pull that stitch along with the top thread, the thread from underneath comes through and pops out fully on the other side. Using those 2 threads on the same side, I'm going to tie a couple knots to hold it in place. Then I'll cut the excess thread to keep it clean. Moving to the other end of the seam, I'll do the same thing. I'll slip the pin under the last stitch and holding the top thread, pull the bottom thread through. Then I'll knot it off. And then moving to the straight stitch, I'll do the same. This one's a bit harder, but you can still slip your pin under the last stitch, pull the bottom thread through, and knot it off. One more time on the other end of the straight stitch. Again, I'll pull the bottom thread through and knot it. Now we have our final product. You can see we have our zigzag stitch here and our straight stitch here. And then we can turn our project right side out and iron it. And you can see we've cleanly attached the two pieces of fabric on two sides. I hope that tutorial was helpful. I'll drop some links below for more information on how to get set up with your sewing machine. Check back in soon because up next I'll give a little tutorial on how to make this simple wrap skirt.